Ignoring its suggestive definition, grinding in real life most often applies to college students crunching hours to meet a deadline, and the Sisyphean means by which we attain money to survive. It has a positive connotation in terms of work ethic and self-fulfillment, but no activity that can be described as a grind is intrinsically fun. In video games, grinding usually refers to the process of repeating the same actions over and over again in pursuit of tangible progress, like killing infinitely respawning enemies to earn currency for leveling up. It sounds like a bizarre concept as it involves partaking in activities that can be as monotonous as actual work, yielding the sole reward of progression in a video game. That said, it's a mechanic that does have its merits when implemented correctly, and is often engaging on a psychological front. Grinding is probably the most synonymous with old-school RPGs. While almost all action platformers on the NES and Super Nintendo were lengthened by increasingly difficult gameplay challenges, RPGs like Dragon Quest and Earthbound feature a far more palpable display of progress. There's definitely some level of strategy to these games, but they mostly reward patience over persistence. In Super Mario Bros., for example, you're likely an inch closer to the end of a difficult stage with each attempt due to practice and sheer muscle memory, but there's no guarantee. You might just be banging your head against a wall. In Final Fantasy, on the other hand, you definitively can't beat certain enemies if you haven't reached a high enough level from grinding weaker enemies. Although it can be demoralizing to encounter a mandatory boss with a far higher level than you, there's some relief in knowing that rectifying this issue is just a matter of time if you can stomach the tedium of repeatedly fighting the same mindless enemies. This isn't the healthiest way of looking at video games, as they're meant to be enjoyed, not just completed. However, it does make certain games more accessible for those who are just intrigued by one's story and world and can put up with a bit of tedium here and there. That said, I personally find it hard to enjoy games where repetition is ingrained into the gameplay loop. There are a number of prominent titles, however, where the player's skill level will determine how much grinding they have to do. Dark Souls is a textbook example. While reaching the top of Sen's Fortress and the bottom of Blight Town will prove formidable challenges no matter what, the relentless boss fights and dungeons teeming with enemies can be made less obnoxious through the player's own efforts. Despite the complexity that emerges from having to level up individual attributes and upgrade weapons and armor through a separate currency, the act of grinding in Dark Souls isn't so different from the act of grinding in traditional RPGs. The implications, however, vary drastically. First off, it features an extra level of depth and customization that makes attaining upgrades a multi-layered and enthralling experience rather than a chore. Although you can directly increase your character's health and damage, you're far more likely to become lost in the endless cycle of obtaining new weapons, leveling up so you're able to use those weapons, farming upgrade shards to maximize their effectiveness, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, these systems give the player a crutch for when victory feels just out of reach, and mitigate the initial feeling of helplessness to overwhelming enemies without outright expunging it. Dark Souls is regarded as an extremely challenging game, and while it's impossible for first-time players to fully sidestep its difficulty, they are given the agency to earn a more forgiving experience through various means. One of the most rewarding moments in any Souls game is when, after the credits roll, you're immediately sent back to the beginning with all of your current upgrades and equipment in tow. It feels awesome to defeat the once imposing early game bosses so easily with the help of new tools at your disposal. That said, New Game Plus is also the epitome of the problem with grinding in Souls-likes. When I went from New Game Plus to a brand new playthrough of Elden Ring, I was unreasonably deterred by how much I struggled against the early bosses. I had certainly gotten better at the game's combat, but it still became clear to me that leveling up and improving weapons had a significant effect on my ability to reach the end credits. No matter how many runes you farm, there's no way to turn Elden Ring's most brooding bosses into pushovers. However, it's hard to separate the player's skill improvement from the character's tangible upgrades in a game like this, and that results in a strange outcome. You don't get the same feeling of productivity that you do in games where grinding is the only form of progress, but you don't get the unadulterated feeling of accomplishment from beating a brutal and unforgiving game either. This issue is pretty much exclusive to explicitly hard games though, and grinding for resources to effectively outsmart easier games can be surprisingly gratifying. When I played Skyrim, for example, I didn't really understand how leveling up worked or where I could find the best weapons and armor, but I did know that I could pause in any scenario to engage with the items in my inventory. More specifically, I realized that I could eat while still in combat to replenish health. As such, I ended up running around from house to house in every town, stealing food and health potions, which I would cheekily use pretty much every time I got hit within a major battle. While traditional RPGs, Souls-likes, and other adventure games motivate players through linear story progression with the promise of an eventual conclusion, MMOs like Destiny and World of Warcraft provide value in smaller-scale player progression. Each level unlock an item is a reward and benchmark in itself, and because of this, players have the option to leave at any time without feeling like they left something major unfinished. It's also impossible to experience all that these types of games have to offer because new content is constantly being added and removed. Likewise, I think casual single-player experiences like Stardew Valley and The Sims benefit from not having endings, as their ongoingness ensures that each and every accomplishment has the same effect on progress. Comparatively, massive video games with definitive endings tend to deprioritize side content. The Witcher 3, GTA 5, Red Dead 2. These games already run at least 50 hours each if you only engage in mandatory content, so it can be really difficult to find the motivation to complete side missions, especially since there are rarely meaningful tangible rewards for doing so. One instance where grinding is super engaging and rewarding is the entirety of Minecraft. While there is technically an ending to the game, most of Minecraft's appeal has to do with intrinsic motivation. What's odd is that I've always lacked the patience and creativity to build unique houses in creative mode where I have infinite resources at my disposal. Ironically, it's the aspect of exploration and resource gathering in survival mode that makes creative endeavors much more digestible. I'm limited by tangible hurdles, such as not having enough blocks, just as much as I am by my own lack of inventiveness. Minecraft is also unique in how players can exploit its systems in order to expedite progress and learn a lot more about the game in doing so. From the outside, utilizing mob spawners to level up as fast as possible without much danger involved and harvesting materials quickly from automatic farms might seem detrimental to the overall experience. However, the context and creativity one needs to construct these builds is far more indicative of Minecraft's greatest qualities than its combat or farming mechanics, for example. Overall, I think it's interesting how the inclusion and execution of this universal mechanic can fundamentally alter, ruin, or bolster the general experience of a game in so many different ways.